Hello, everybody. It is Steve, your friendly neighborhood lawn gnome. Welcome back to another episode over here on That's Comical. And if you're watching it, it happens to be a Wednesday. Happy New Comic Book Day. So happy Friday. I hope you all had a good work week. It was definitely a busy one over by me. And if you weren't working, hopefully you just had a good week in general. It was nice where we were, weather-wise, outside of the one day of the storms. But you know what? I'm glad that we're here. I'm here with my fellow colleague over here on the channel. Annie, how you doing?
Hey, I'm doing really good, and I'm really happy to be having this conversation. This will be a fun one. They always are, but this is a big one.
Yeah, absolutely. And you hit the nail right on the head. Big one. Welcome, everybody who is here. If you're new, let me just say you definitely picked a good video to start with. And if you've been here for a while, I really hope that you're all excited for this brand new limited series over here on our channel, even though it's going to take a very, very long time to finish. So, this is a show that we like to call Ultimate Journey. Why are we giving it this name? Well, whether you are new to the comic scape or if you are a seasoned veteran. Now, Andy and I may have a lot of knowledge, but we know people that are much more knowledgeable in the world of comics than we are.
Yeah.
When you are part of this community and part of these amazing worlds in the pages of comics, eventually a question is going to come to mind and it's going to be scattered throughout your lexicon. And that is, what is the greatest comic book story ever told? And normally, when you think about that exact question, you look to the big two. You look to Marvel and DC Comics. Almost 100 years worth of storytelling, so many well-known events, characters, stories, and more importantly, great men and women behind the pages that wrote and drew them. So we actually had this conversation, even though it is something that has come up in many of our previous conversations with each other and with others who love to read the comics. So I think it is safe to say, through our own comic know-how, as well as looking into the community itself, whether it's YouTube channels, whether it's message boards, or other kinds of websites and articles that talk about the greatest comic stories ever told, I think it is safe to say that we may have possibly pinpointed two of the best, one from DC and one from Marvel. And that is what we're going to be doing on the Ultimate Journey. We're not just going to be talking about these two specific stories in general. We're going to be taking you on the road to how we get there. So that means what also makes a great story is the work and the tales that have been told before it that got us to those points, and possibly maybe even a little beyond. So we're going to start today with DC's Ultimate Journey, and we're going to do Marvel's next, and we're just going to go back and forth. We're also going to let you guys know a very important detail. As we go through these journeys in Marvel and DC, we're going to also let you know that what we're going to be featuring on these episodes is not the only stuff that you can read. We're only giving you the big pieces of the story that really do drive them forward, even though there are so many other connected tissues, if you will, to this gigantic landscape. So with each episode, not only will you get a link to the playlist so you can start from episode 1 if you're late to the party, but we will, in every episode, before we go into the current story that we're going to be featuring on each episode, we're going to let you know about a couple of other things that you can look into and read if you want to get a larger perspective. So, Andy, did I get all that right? Do you think I said everything correctly?
Yeah, I was actually going to say I think that is mirroring exactly my understanding of the project, my hope for the project. And I think you are exactly right in the way you're framing it. So we're going to be talking about big stories, probably the biggest, and they are made up of the biggest stories. And that's definitely what we have to talk about tonight is the big story in a sense.
Right.
Yeah.
So what are these two stories that we're leading into? We might as well just let you guys know where our destination is. So in the world of DC, especially when it comes to a lot of people say that the greatest comic book story ever told in DC may in fact be the 2008 epic Blackest Night by Geoff Johns. And can I agree with that? It's possible. And it's because of all the great stories that led us to it. And in the world of Marvel, we are going to get to the end destination of Jonathan Hickman's 2015 masterpiece, Secret Wars. So there's a lot of great stories that are entangled in this web. And I'm very excited for tonight because we are going to start at a great starting point on the road to Blackest Night with DC Comics, especially considering the fact that this story is going to be reaching its 40th anniversary next year. We are going to start with a great moment in DC history, actually a great starting point for people who really don't know where to start with DC Comics, and that is from the great Marv Wolfman and the late George Perez, 1985's Crisis on Infinite Earths. I actually decided I'm going to go dig into my comic boxes to get this iconic cover, and I am very proud to be an owner of the original floppies. I don't know how I did it, but I managed to get all 12 issues of this great miniseries for only $68. I don't know how I did it, but I did it. And if you can't get your hands on the original floppies, it's very good to say that this year there are actually going to be facsimiles of all 12 issues coming out this year, and that's a great treat. So before we get into Crisis on Infinite Earths, if you want to find out really what leads to Crisis of Infinite Earths, that's a little bit more of a confusing thing. Truth be told, there really is not necessarily a starting point for the Crisis on Infinite Earths story, but the first tale of what is known as the DC multiverse was introduced in Gardner Fox's legendary Flash of Two Worlds story, which started with issue number 123 of The Flash. And you can easily pick up the hardback, which is what I have, so you can see all the stories of Barry Allen, the Silver Age Flash, meeting Jay Garrick, the original Justice Society Golden Age Flash. And that would also lead into the story of Justice League of America, issue number 21, which introduced us to the return of the JSA, where we discover that these two superhero teams are, in fact, on two separate worlds, Earth 1 and Earth 2. And that's where the confusion starts to set in, because this is where people start asking questions throughout the entire Silver Age, Bronze Age, Dark Age. It starts to get a little confusing for people, because people are asking, why are certain characters still the same age that they are? Or how is it that all of these worlds exist? Like, why is it that they do exist? So in 1985, Marv Wolfman and George Perez were tapped, saying, we gotta fix this mess. So let's create a 12-part story where we completely get rid of the multiverse and just create Earth 1. That's basically what the goal of Crisis on Infinite Earths was. And what do we get? Well, I would say we got a truly epic adventure. Everything you could possibly ask for in Crisis on Infinite Earths is there. There's drama, there's comedy, there's tons of action, and there's also a couple of things that we didn't necessarily see before in comics, or at least something that we hadn't seen since the late 1940s, early 1950s. We had actually seen it in Marvel Comics in the late 1970s, early 1980s, with one of the greatest Marvel stories ever told, Chris Claremont's Dark Phoenix saga, and that was the death of a popular character. We got a bunch of those in this one.
That we did. And it is, I think in talking about the history of it and talking about the simplifying of the DC continuity and the universe, I think this is an important part to point out that while we started by saying this book is almost 40 years old, DC was 50 years old at the
That's
time.
correct.
So there was a lot of history to be flattening, to be merging. And the same way, even though there's more history now, the same way that someone coming into comics new would look at the field of comics and say, where do I start? You would do that at the time that Crisis on Infinite Earths came out. And the answer was even more nebulous. Now, I can tell you, if you are a completionist person, a safe place to start for DC is right here. You can enjoy this book without that much prior knowledge of the DC universe. You can enjoy this book with a kind of entry level knowledge of the DC universe, I think. And Steve, it's fine if you disagree, but in my mind, I see it that way because there's something for everybody. It is an incredibly rewarding read if you have knowledge of some of that older canon prior to Crisis, but by its inherent nature, it's designed to be things are getting flattened, things are getting reset. You read this story, and now these are the heroes. This is the world. Um, and you will see that in following this journey with us because Geoff Johns is going to really, really play with what we learn in this story and what we learn in several stories coming after, like a mad scientist, making us realize that somebody actually remembers absolutely everything somehow. Um, but I think that this story is a lot of things. But one thing I want to make sure that I say kind of early on in the discussion is accessible is one of the things that it is. So if people want to read along with us, that's great. Don't feel that you need to have read the first 50 years of DC Comics in
Hey,
order to start at this point and read it with us.
no, I agree with you there because, and the interesting thing is, when I got back into comics in 2019, Blackest Night was the first thing on my mind that I knew that I wanted to pick up because I knew based on things that I had read, things that I had watched, this was like another iconic landmark DC story. But I never, ever would have imagined how much backtracking that I ended up doing, knowing what I know now, knowing how many amazing stories were involved in getting to that point. And as I said earlier, even believe it or not, a little beyond, because the truth is, we will have to go a teensy bit past Blackest Night to see this whole story come full circle. I'm telling you that. It's crazy, but yes, it's accessible. Christ on Infinite Earth, you can get the beautiful trade paperback with the legendary cover by the great Alex Ross. And it's definitely a book that you can read numerous times. I mean, I will definitely say that if there was anything negative that I could say about the book is it's a teensy bit dialogue heavy. And the thing is, that was the time. A
Mhm.
lot of great stories, especially in Marvel comics, more so the X-Men stories. Those were very dialogue heavy, but every word was crucial and every panel was important. And
Mhm.
the same can be said about Crisis. But yeah, I never really had any desire except for reading Flash of Two Worlds. That was the, and maybe picking up a couple of facsimiles of
Mhm.
some of the most iconic DC comics just for the sake of basking in what the past was and just like reading these iconic books for the first time. I've never believed that there was really a large amount of golden age and silver age or even bronze age books that I really needed to pick up. I really feel that Crisis on Infinite Earth is a great place to start with DC.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. And I will say, because I'm not sure where in the conversation it'd be most natural to bring it up. I mean, it's important to note at this moment on the journey what this like story is this is what really popularized the whole crossover event thing, right? Like if you come into comics now, it's like almost every year there's some will change the universe forever. This story is across multiple books, read this part, all that stuff. Um And Crisis on Infinite Earths, more than pretty much any crossover event other than Marvel's Secret Wars,
which came out a year
potentially, which we will
before.
also talk about, um, really lives up to what it said it was going to do. And every crossover event since, um, really kind of feels like the shadow on Plato's cave of the crossover event that Crisis casts.
Well,
Um,
that's very true. I mean, actually, it was 1984's Marvel Superhero Secret Wars that began the idea of the whole
right.
crossover. And I'm actually reading that for the first time right now. But what
Mm-hmm.
I'm definitely going to say is, even though I'm almost halfway through 84 Secret Wars, I will say that I can see when I compare that to Christ on Infinite Earth, which Crisis came out exactly 1 year later, I feel that the purpose for 84 Secret Wars was more of a gimmick. I
Yes.
don't know. I think it was more gimmicky. It's not a very deep story. It's fun. I don't really think we'll be. I don't think we're going to be covering the
Yeah.
original Secret Wars much. We're going to be focusing on 2015's.
Yeah.
But I will say that when it comes to the concept of the world crossover in comics, Secret Wars opened the door, but Crisis on Infinite Earth tore the door off of its hinges because there's a
Exactly.
deep, meaty story here.
Yeah. Secret Wars 84 is here's a bunch of characters coming together the way that you play with action figures. And Crisis on Infinite Earths was we really truly are going to deliver on changing the entire universe and canon of our comic books forever after. Um, which Marvel would then later do very well, which we will also talk about.
Yeah.
But yes, so I wanted to say that in so many words. And I will also add that while this is an incredible story, and a really fun read. Um, I love it, and it's nowhere close to one of my favorite comics, and it's also nowhere close on my list of like greatest comics. But but I think it's absolutely wonderful. I don't have a lot negative to say about it, um, and I think that were it not for this book, comics as a whole would look so different that it is one of the most important stories ever told. So when I say, and my initial thesis was to the completionist who's like, I want to go back, where do I start? And I intend to read everything. This is the point you would point them to if they really meant that. But I continue to maintain that I don't think that's the best way to enjoy comics. I don't think you should feel like you need to start at the beginning and read absolutely everything. Um, but I think that it's important that such a point actually kind of exists with DC in this day and age.
Yeah, I will agree. It's definitely not my favorite story, but I will never deny the importance.
Yeah.
So,
And it's great. It's up there.
yeah,
I'm just saying
right.
it's not a
Absolutely.
contender for my favorite, but it's great.
Yes. And you will see why it is such an important story as we move along on Ultimate Journey. So, the story basically is starting with a call has gone out to the heroes of the multiverse. What is the multiverse? Well, besides it being my favorite concept in science fiction, as a matter of fact, Andy, I don't think I've ever actually said this to you, but I don't necessarily believe in things like paranormal. I don't necessarily believe in things like time travel, but I can seriously believe that the idea of the multiverse is real
For
because
the
it
record, me too. Just
because it is
just so you
based
know, for the
on
record, me
because
too.
it's just based on the human condition.
Yeah.
The idea of the multiverse is basically every person who has ever lived has hit multiple crossroads in their lives. And they're all given this choice. You go one way, you go the other way, or you just create something completely out of the blue. I mean, the great Robert Frost said it best: I took the road less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. But with each crossroads and path that you choose, there's that thought in the back of your mind: what if I went in the other direction? So the concept of the multiverse is, what if you did? What if some version of you went in that other direction. And here's that world in where you took that choice. Like, let's say that you had two job offers. One of them was at a big accounting firm, one of them was at a smaller accounting firm. And you wanted to make a bigger difference by going into the smaller accounting firm instead of having to struggle to climb the corporate ladder. Well, what if you chose to climb the corporate ladder? What happened then? Would you be making more money? Would you be living in a better house? Would you be married to a better person? I mean, not to say that the spouses that we have are not wonderful people, but you see what I'm getting at. And this is where I have to throw out my favorite line from one of my oldest and dearest friends, Gary, who says, in a possible world of ultimate and infinite possibilities, meaning he's talking about the multiverse, there is definitely a world in some shape or form where I am, in fact, a rodeo clown. So that's what the multiverse is. So that means a cosmic supernatural being named the Monitor has asked his associate, the Harbinger, to go throughout the multiverse and get the greatest heroes within those infinite worlds and say, we have a problem. Something out there is destroying different worlds throughout the multiverse, and your world is next. So this is where the fun begins. We see a plethora. We see everybody. We see the current Superman and the Golden Age Superman. We see different versions of Batman. We see different versions of Green Lantern. We see
everyone.
We even
I mean, we see well, obviously we see Flashes. We see everyone, basically everyone who ever lived on Krypton and then decided we have too many Kryptonians, to put it mildly. It's and we see, I mean, we see characters that you don't even think of as like the DC superhero canon. You know, we travel space time and emphasis on time in order to see some moments in the past outside of what was then the modern DC canon, right? It's a true retrospective on absolutely everything and a reminder that these books started so scattershot, right? I think something that's important to think of with the multiverse also, Steve, is that we kind of defined it as a multiverse essentially with this story, right? Before it was like non-canon, this isn't canon to this, it's confusing, but if you read this book, this didn't actually happen in this book. But it's really with this, okay, that's all canon, right? But it's all happening in different universes. But now we're going to flatten it. We're going to vibrate it. We're going to overlap it,
yeah.
which ends up being the crux of our story and the climax moments.
And we also see some characters that we hadn't seen in DC Comics for a while. We were reintroduced to the Crime Syndicate from Earth 3, which is basically what if the Justice League was a bunch of bad guys. So that's always a great, interesting thing to see. And we are also introduced once again to the Justice Society. We're introduced to Huntress, who happens to be the daughter of Batman and Catwoman in a different universe. So there's so many different things, and we even get callbacks to characters like Sergeant Rock or Commandy, the last boy on Earth. Solivar from Ape City gets a big role in this story. So many DC characters. And I think what's also very interesting is not everyone has a speaking role, but everyone who is anybody in the world of DC Comics, if anything, gets a panel. And I really have to give the credit to Wolfman and Perez for really going above and beyond to make sure that everyone, if they didn't have a voice, they had an appearance. And I think that's one of the biggest positives, and not just the heroes. There's even a couple of pieces of this story where the villains have a great romp as well, which is also something that, you know, I guess you could say it's something that breaks the tension. Like, let's just have the villains do a bunch of crazy things and let's have a good laugh and a fun adventure. And that's also great to know that we had that in this book, too. There's a little bit of something that you love that everybody loves in this story.
And in bringing it all together like that, I think it's a really good time to talk about just the incredible work that George Perez did in this story, because by bringing all of these disparate books together, there was a unified shared look where everything worked, everything looked as you expected them, shone with the light of where they originally came from, but sat within this one book together without looking like too much of a Frankenstein's monster. And it's like you said, characters, regardless of what kind of role they got to play in the story, there was an understanding that you can't have a crossover event without Plastic Man appearing. You can't do it. It's just not.
No, you can't.
You are
You
not
can't.
allowed.
Yeah, I love
but
Plastic Man.
but yeah, that is a very very important piece of the puzzle. Is the overall look of the story, and beyond it just being a well done work. I think it's important to say it's not just that it looks good; it's that it made everything come together in a way to look good, and that takes. I mean that takes an immense amount of talent. So this is my moment to just give the well deserved shout out to the work of George Perez in this book.
Yeah, even the Joker gets a really good moment early on in the story as well. But
Mm-hmm.
there are certain characters that do, in fact, take up most of the time because they are the most important pieces of this story. Obviously, one of them is the Monitor, the supernatural cosmic being that is trying to save the multiverse. We obviously have his harbinger, Lila, who is another crucial part of this puzzle. And there is also Supergirl that has a big role to play. The Flash, meaning Barry Allen, has a big role to play. And then there are these two other characters that just come out of nowhere, and they probably, maybe next to the Monitor, have the biggest role to play of all. And that is Pariah and Psychopirate, who is a character I am dying to talk about with you because I really want to hear your thoughts on that specific character. But the Monitor and Harbinger, I think, first.
Yeah, yeah. So I guess that's a natural place to start. I think Monitor really reads as that like necessary, immensely powerful, otherworldly being to kick off this kind of story, right? And I do think that I'm trying to think. It's difficult for me to say because so much of what makes this story great is what this story is informed by and what it informs. So that which is, and this might be one of the things I should like cards on the table that puts it from great but not my favorite, that puts it in that pile, right? Is these characters that are new to this story but central to this story. Um, they don't give you that same like oh boy, because like so much of this crossover event is it's the feeling that people had in the theater seeing Avengers, the hero shot of everybody coming together, right? So Monitor fills that role great. Harbinger fills that role of being the support but being the linchpin to certain parts of the story. And I think Pariah, especially the way Pariah is written, has some really really phenomenal moments and some great individual lines, which I should flip open my book and grab a couple of them.
Yeah, yeah.
But Pariah in particular is a really, I think, intriguing character. And I also, something I want to point out about Pariah that's like a minor point, but it's really interesting. I feel like this was a time that like I feel like it might have been weird to have like powerful heroes shown displaying as much emotion as Pariah displays at this time in comics. I found that to be really cool. And
Well,
I
when your
think
power is the ability to watch worlds collapsing before they happen, you can. It's very hard for you not to be emotional
right.
because I think at the end of the day, what this guy really wanted was just a good night's sleep
Yeah, and
because
I think
all he saw was world dying.
and I think I'm just saying I think at the time when this book was written, you could see a version of Pariah that's like really stoic and is like like essentially almost like a grim reaper, like, oh, I guess this world is next. And that's like not how Pariah is portrayed or written, which I think is really cool and really forward thinking for the time too, to have that outward display of loss, of grief, that feeling that he's weeping on several pages of this book. um I thought that's cool as hell. So of the original characters, Pariah is a standout for me. Acting in for the forward momentum of the story, yes. But for what I thought he kind of represented to a tone in comics,
So
he really
I'm
mattered to me more than the Monitor. The Monitor
right.
is a kind of character I feel like can be introduced in like your golden age serialized one shot. Someone doesn't end up sticking around, but you talk about them like, oh, there's an omnipotent being, like that kind of thing. Pariah, by contrast, struck me as really, really interesting. Harbinger as well.
Because I was
I will
curious to
say.
know, I was curious to ask you about Pariah because of the fact that his character is truly driven by his emotions. Did you? Because this is how I felt. Because it had been a while since I actually read the story. Because Pariah, it was really hard for me at times trying to figure out, is he on the good side or is he on the evil side? Because you can't really tell because he's just so crazy with emotion because of what he's seeing.
Yeah.
You can't really tell if he is really trying to preserve something or if he might actually be posing a very serious threat.
Yeah. And I mean that's so I mean like my reading of it is very clearly, preserve good character. That's how I was reading it as I read the story. But I think the power of the character, and I mean literally like what his, ability is, as grim as it is, um it's one where you could see someone going through what he has been forced to endure, could either desperately want to save the multiverse or be like, dear Lord, let it end.
Yeah, so I can get my nap.
Exactly. So you could see the character being written either way. You could see it happening either way. It had that been the choice,
Mm-hmm.
right? But I think it's that complexity and that like question of how a person will deal with the adversity put before them, which makes Pariah an interesting character to read, which makes Pariah a great addition to the story.
Part of the group of people that Harbinger reaches into the multiverse to select, these people are being tasked with creating structures across the multiverse to prevent these destructive waves from destroying these Earths. And this is where we see a brilliant choosing of some of the smartest minds throughout DC. We see characters like Mr. Terrific get tapped, Blue Beetle get tapped, including a new character at the time, Dr. Light, who was officially introduced for the very first time as a hero. There was an evil version of Dr. Light before that, and this is a character that we will actually, believe it or not, be revisiting on the Ultimate Journey. So they build these spires and then they ask certain characters to go on to these various Earths where the structure is built to guard it, to make sure that these stay where they're supposed to stay. And of course, this is where we start seeing the antagonists getting fleshed out because shadow demons start coming through portals out of nowhere and start trying to attack these structures. And heroes are basically being told to teleport down, teleport back, get new people so they can, I guess, refresh the bullpen, if you will. So the first couple of issues is basically that is the main crux of the story. But there's also another interesting character that shows up, and that is Lex Luthor from Earth 3. Or, as they say in this story, it's Alexander Luthor, who, believe it or not, is also going to play a big role further down the Ultimate Journey.
Yeah, and a really, really big character to this story, to say the least, and introduced in a way that is a fun plays with the multiverse thing,
Sort of a
right?
take on Superman as well.
Exactly. It plays with the multiverse in that we have this idea of, what if, right? The multiverse is always answering the question, what if, what if, what if? And this character is really, I mean, it's basically what if Lex Luthor was Superman, but not just the Lex Luthor we know with Superman powers. What if literally Lex Luthor had this origin story that Superman has? And so it kind of shows you from early on in the story, this is the kind of level of what if they're going to be taking it to, and is going to end up being as important, to the point where he acts alongside essentially as one of the Kryptonians when everyone gets together in later parts of the story we'll talk about later. But he is also a very interesting addition to the story that, you're right, will come up later in our journey as well.
Mm-hmm. And so, as these events are taking place, and that's something that I actually didn't remember because it had been such a long time since I read this book. As a matter of fact, if I'm going to be perfectly honest with you, I don't even know if I finished it the first time I was reading it. I think I only got halfway, but
Mm-hmm.
Harbinger out of nowhere kills the Monitor.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that is when we start to get a little bit of an understanding of who Psycho Pirate is, because Psycho Pirate was one of the Monitor's chosen. So why are you choosing this specific character who is definitely not turning out to be a hero? Rather, he's turning out to be somewhat of a villain. And this is a guy who's got another very unique power. This man has the ability to manipulate emotions and cause conflict and pain and frustration, anger. And he has the ability to go in the exact opposite, but the whole concept of the multiverse is the choices that we make. He
Mm-hmm.
chooses not to go in that direction. He goes in the wrong direction.
Yeah,
At
and he
least that's
goes
what most
about as
people think.
far in the wrong direction as you can go when it comes to the DC universe. Um, but I will say, there is that level of like comic book machinations. This was my plan all along element to it. Monitor prepared for kind of how things went. But it also goes to show you the thesis, which does end up coming true to an extent later in the story, which is we're talking about the end of existence here, right? And so Monitor is like, we're going to call upon greatest heroes, greatest villains. It's not about like what you've done, good or bad. It's about your ability to prevent the end of existence. And as far as the Monitor is concerned, anybody who's on the side of this will lead to the path of the multiverse continues to exist in some way, that there is existence at all, it's worth bringing them into the fold. There's a certain like omniscience to his machinations, lead to the Monitor's death, lead to more events of the story, lead to power being unleashed, lead to the preservation of worlds, all of this kind of stuff. But again, it's more that moment of showing it wasn't about hero or villain, it was about preserving existence. Everyone has a stake in the stakes that are raised in Crisis on Infinite Earths.
Mm-hmm. And through these actions, because we obviously find out that Harbinger did not even realize that she did what she did, and then she is overflowing with guilt. But that is also when we discover exactly who Psycho Pirate is in fact working for.
Mm-hmm.
And that is when we are introduced to a character called the Anti-Monitor.
Mm-hmm.
So let me ask you a question. If you were reading this book for the first time, would you have seen the idea of the Anti-Monitor coming? Or was this something that would have been a total shock to you? Because this is where I would definitely see a lot of people, maybe not everybody, but definitely a large chunk of people who are reading this book for the first time. I could see a bunch of them saying, "Oh God, that is so predictable."
Well, it's really comic book,
Yeah.
right? It and I think in a story that's trying to do something as grand as Crisis on Infinite Earths, we can just get away with how simple that is, and that's fine. I don't think, it's one of those like, it's elegant in its simplicity in how complex the story around it is. Um, I do think by the silhouette we were seeing for the entire time, it was very, telling from the very first panel of his silhouette what was going on there.
Mm-hmm.
Um, we resisted the urge to take it in an even hokier direction, but that was fine. does the antagonist of Crisis on Infinite Earths matter all that much in the grand scheme of things? Is kind of the question that I am left with. And this is my moment to say no. And I think the reason that we're talking about Crisis on Infinite Earths is the stakes and the outcome and the gravity of what happens in the pages. This is not where we are going to talk about beautiful foils of villains. This is not where we are going to talk about what a villain revealed about the human condition. This is also a moment for me to say what makes this story great is this story is fun. And
Oh
we
yeah.
say that about comics sometimes, and I want to make sure we make it really clear about this one. This is a summer blockbuster. The villain is filling the role the villain needs to fill in this, which is destroy existence. Got it, you know. And I think there is a place for that. So canon of greatest DC villains ever, no, but one of the most fun stories ever told and an important kind of, foot on the gas, yeah.
And so he, of course, is revealed at the bleakest moment when the big wave is on its way, and all of a sudden, boom, we're saved. We're now officially in this pocket universe, and there's was it two remaining Earths or was it five remaining
there were
Earths?
there were two at first, but we
Right.
do have five remaining Earths at a certain point in the story.
Yeah, and that is when some very interesting see, this is the thing. If you were not having fun yet, now is where the fun really begins, because this is when a lot of
Dinosaurs
interesting
are running
things
around
happen.
Gotham City.
Yep, that's one of the problems with the Pocket Universe. As a matter of fact, in the animated films, because I don't recall them referring to it in this version, but they refer to it in the upcoming third installment of the animated trilogy, The Bleed. And they say the problem with the bleed is time has no meaning here. So, like you said, there's dinosaurs running around Gotham City. There are flying cars in the metropolis. There are crazy things happening. And because of the fact that this is happening, the heroes are unfortunately dealing with a very big distraction.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't mean that there can't be room for the origins of the Monitor. And
Mm-hmm.
that is when we get into, believe it or not, for the ultimate journey, the most important part of the story, where we learn about the times long ago and the origins of the Guardians and one
Mm-hmm.
specific curious cat who goes by the name of Krona,
Mm-hmm.
who wants to touch the beginning of existence. And doing that, he creates the anti-monitor, he creates the antimatter universe, and pretty much is responsible for the multiverse as a whole.
Yeah. So you're right. So this is, to like really narrow down the journey here to Blackest Night. This is the part that's like most directly involved.
And I think the
Um,
funniest part was when I found out about this character, I was like, wow, I really have to go back to Crisis on Infinite Earths for the start of this story.
and so that's the thing. It's like Crisis on Infinite Earths is the start of the modern DC universe as a
Mm-hmm.
whole. It's also the start of our story getting to Blackest Night, both because Blackest Night is truly that deep and truly reads as an encyclopedia of what Geoff John's knowledge is of the modern DC universe.
And how much he
But
loves it.
yes, but also because there is this moment that we pull from specifically. And might it have been chosen because it comes at this point in time to encourage readers to understand that this is kind of the lens of where in DC canon we are starting with this story? Probably. But it is a cool moment to keep in mind for as we move forward for the broader purpose of what these videos are going to be about. Um, but moving back to Crisis on Infinite Earths on its own.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's one thing that we learn. And then, of course, with so little amount of Earth to divide and conquer, the villains officially say, hey, let's fuck things up a little bit more, you know? So Brainiac calls upon Earth One's Lex Luthor, the Lex Luthor that we all know, the bald one, the one in the flashy suits, the evil one. And he says, let's conquer these remaining Earths. Let's get all the villains together and let's divide up what remains of what exists in the multiverse. Yeah, that's gonna work.
Yeah, it's a brainiac plan. But I will say, and this goes back to talking about the canon and the pieces going into the story. In our conversations about Superman, I think that this is a really fun use of the Brainiac character, and I think this is one of the moments that pays off, that we're getting to explore the characters that we're keeping around and the versions of them that they're keeping around, right? We see a few Lex Luthors in this story, to put it mildly, and it's fun to get to see. It's very modern. So I'm going to keep using the word modern when talking about this story, because a lot of these things have been commonplace. It's fun to get to see different versions of characters be in the same story and see how a what if version of a character how a what if version of a character interacts with a different scenario. It's exactly like you said before, Steve, when talking about just like what the concept of the multiverse is, right? The other path, what one could have done. It's fun to get to see those different versions of the characters that exist and we know, and maybe they don't exist anymore. But it's a great use of it.
Mm-hmm. And then, of course, I feel that this is where we really need to take a little bit of time to step back and really absorb it. We get two big sacrificial moments
Yeah,
in the battle against the first big battle against the Anti-Monitor,
yeah,
and it couldn't be more of a cost than with one of the most purest heroes in all of DC Comics lore. And that, of course, is the death of Supergirl, but of course also the death of the Flash, Barry Allen.
yeah,
And the thing that's really surprising to me after rereading this is the Flash's death didn't come off as a massive delivery in the comic more so than Supergirl's death.
yeah,
Because when you think of Supergirl's death, you see the tears, you see Clark clutch her body, and the 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 death of Supergirl. For me, that's the climax of the story
yeah,
because the death of Supergirl causes Golden Age Superman to go ballistic because of the fact that he officially loses all hope. Because the thing that I love so much about that point is that's when we start to get a massive amount of character development in such a small period of time.
yeah,
What is Golden Age Superman's main purpose of saving this multiverse, of preserving life? Because he doesn't want to lose Lois. He doesn't want
yeah,
to lose his true love. And the minute he finds out that he might have, in fact, lost her, he is ready to kill.
yeah,
He is ready to use his powers to the fullest of his ability with no sense of rhyme or reason. But Flash passes away, and it's crazy with the way that he dies. He has a very cool death. I hate to
yeah,
say that word, but you basically see his body disintegrate.
yeah,
And but all they say is Barry's gone.
yeah,
There was like
yeah,
no serious remorse. There was no tears. No one was like falling on their knees and screaming to the heavens why.
hmm. Yeah. You know what? You're right. It's funny when I mean, like with any big event, you think of the big moments in it. And, if you had asked me going into the story, what are the biggest points of Crisis on Infinite Earths, I would say, the creation of new canon, the flattening of the lore, obviously. But then in the events of the story, you'd say the death of Barry Allen and the death of Supergirl. Um, but you're right, Supergirl's moment is bigger, and I not to just echo you too much here, but I think you're right. I think a lot of it has to do with Superman. Um, but Golden Age Superman. But yeah, the reaction to Barry Allen's death in the story. I have a reaction to Barry to Barry Allen's death. It's interesting to think about it purely in the text, though, because real world, I say those are the two big things in the story, but in the text of the story, one really does overshadow the other.
Hmm. Yeah. But of course, these 2 points are definitely going to have a massive payoff as we continue on the ultimate journey, which makes me very excited.
Yeah. In
And
addition to the
then,
moment we just talked about, which is the reason we go back here, I think anytime, I guess we should, I don't know how much this spoils the idea of Blackest Night, but if people want like a little bit of like guide rails while reading all these many stories as we get to Blackest Night, I guess the most important thing to keep track of is anything that goes on with the Green Lantern Corps, and anytime someone dies, be like really aware of it anytime someone dies when you're reading these comics. Not that you would miss that. It's the stuff that's usually
yeah,
easiest to
I
remember.
hate I hate to say something like this, but yes, the most important part of this ultimate journey in the
Yeah,
world
it's
of
who
DC
dies.
is death.
It's funny.
Not just the content of death, but who exactly
I
dies.
remember it's like not to like go too far off the rails, but like before it became really awful when it was at its best. I'm really going outside the box for a second here, so just bear with me. I really hated the talk around Game of Thrones when Game of Thrones was actively airing. Because
Hmm.
as a fan of those books, I was just loving seeing it get recreated on the screen. And I felt like the pop culture read of the show was one of those who died. Because they like, who did anyone die last night? Did you see like the episodes? And and it's yes, it's a story that's comfortable with killing their darlings, which is great and all. But it's not like the focus of the story. Like I really want to know what went on. I don't just want to know who dies. I'm not a fan of The Walking Dead. I don't know The
I
Walking
don't
Dead
care for it either.
intimately, but I have many friends who do, and I remember them expressing the same thing as I always would with Game of Thrones when it was airing, which was they were getting frustrated with the popular culture reading of who died this week, who died this week, which the story does a little bit to itself. Anyway, I editorialize. I say that because when I say focus on the deaths, remember them, you probably would have anyway. They're big moments. They're largely done well in what we're going to be reading. But it's critical to the narrative. When they're done well, they're not just for shock purposes, and it's narratively important and enriching to be
Yeah,
aware of
now
them.
now that you're telling me this, and I'm really glad you did, now we're actually gonna have to start off certain videos saying, so just to bring you up to speed, here's who died this time. So
Yeah, I
unfortunately, I
know.
think we may have to do that. Oh dear
I know.
God.
We're probably
You
gonna
know,
have to, which
I
is
really
like,
hope that you don't go from this video series and thinking about the ultimate journey in DC. And if you have to explain it to other people, please do not turn it into a once upon a time everybody dies
everybody
the end
dies.
scenario.
Yeah,
That's
it's
not the
like
case here.
it's so funny that I like Blackest Night as much as I do, and I appreciate what it is
Oh, it's
because
so great. It
it's
really
so,
is.
yeah, it's just so funny that like the way to talk about it, you end up talking a little bit like the people who I dislike, who I don't think are reading deeply enough into their media and are focused entirely on who lives and dies and not focused on what they do with their, with their lives. But it's narratively enriching and critically important to be aware of it. So we're
Yeah,
gonna we're gonna be focusing on deaths as we talk about these stories, not
but it's for
because of
good reason,
shocking twist, but for like enriching narrative reason.
right?
And I say that, but I say that to myself to remind myself that I can let go of this like hold up that I have around character death in media.
So before we get into the final showdown with the Anti-Monitor, we have to talk about the big villain event. And I would not be surprised if Bruce Timm took a ton of inspiration from that and created that amazing Justice League Unlimited episode
Yeah.
in Gorilla Grodd's
Yep.
headquarters where all the villains are fighting each other, because that is
Yeah.
one of the greatest things he ever did.
It's got to be, right? I mean, that's one of the moments to inform it. So you, and I mean, there's you were talking about the story having a little something for everyone. So you get some comic, right? You get like literally comedy. Um, but it's one of those things that we've talked about this with a lot of comics we have read on this channel, not just a big story like this one. When you write a story, sometimes you owe it to yourself to do certain things that you have the opportunity to do. And I think that the team up of the villains is one of those things that's like, all of reality is coming together. We've got all these characters together. We explicitly said they're bringing heroes and villains into the fold, so the villains will be around too, right? And it's one of those, we owe it to ourselves. What are we doing here if we don't take a break away and do a villain team up for a little bit? And I
Yeah.
think ends up leading to one of the, some might say for better or worse, but I think for better, one of the more memorable moments of the arc, in the villain team up.
Yeah. And if you have an enjoyable time with that issue, then I would highly recommend that you check out the miniseries that was part of the DC New 52, Forever Evil. It's just
Mm-hmm.
villain on villain on villain, and it's shenanigans all around. Such an enjoyable read. But so a very interesting team is put together for the final showdown against the Anti-Monitor. And again, one of them is Superboy. And the funny thing was, when Superboy showed up, I was saying to myself, where the hell has he been? Like, we haven't seen him in the, and we have to remember, this is a very interesting character because this Superboy is the Silver Age Superboy. And this character was written at a time where they basically made Superman, or Superboy in this case, pretty much invincible. This was a version of Superman that could pull a planet out of an orbit with a sneeze. That's how powerful this Superboy was. So it's Superboy, Golden Age Superman, Alexander Luthor, and we also find out that Golden Age Superman's Lois is not gone. She actually has been found, that she actually is alive. So hope is brought back to Superman, but he still does not want to lose her. So it's these crucial players that are chosen along with the other DC heroes to take the Anti-Monitor down. And wouldn't you know, Victorious. Victorious drinks all around like you didn't see that coming. Because you have to. You
You
have to let
have
it
to.
happen.
You have to. You owe it to the readers in a story like this, I think. Um, and it doesn't change anything about the ride. I'm not sitting here and saying good guys win
No.
makes for a bad ending or something at all. If anything, I would say it's fulfilling to get to see something that is somehow clean, despite the fact that, as you just said, that is a weird grouping of characters for the for the final confrontation. But Superboy aside, earned. I mean, we've been seeing Alexander Luthor throughout the whole story. We know that he's critically important with the positive and negative energies inside him. We know that Golden Age Superman is Golden Age Superman. It's fitting. And when you're talking about a cosmic shifting reality rendering fight, these are the characters with the canon that we've established at the time that are going to be there on the front lines.
And the result outside of the Anti-Monitor being defeated is the fact that the multiverse has officially been combined into one single Earth. And the most important thing is that all of these faces that were originally brought together to save existence have survived. And now it's just a matter of, where do we go from here? So what we do know is what happens to the heroes that headed up the front lines to take down the Anti-Monitor. They are given paradise. They are basically able to live in a place where they can just be happy, be free, and just enjoy the simple pleasures of life. And I think the interesting thing was, correct me if I'm wrong, Superboy didn't necessarily have to go in that direction. He chose to.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But all Golden Age Superman wanted was to just be with Lois.
Yeah.
And Alexander Luthor just wanted peace. Superboy just, for some strange reason, felt that in this single Earth, he felt out of place. He
Hmm.
felt that he didn't necessarily belong. So he wanted to go with these big faces that he felt were the most omnipotent and the most powerful.
Hmm.
And that's why he felt he needed to go there.
Yeah, just
What
his
happens
his
somewhere down the
place.
line, we'll find out.
Yeah, yeah, his place. I guess it's also at this point in the story with kind of the merging of the universes and all of that. I'm trying to think. I'm trying to think. I mean, Spectre matters a lot down the line in the
Yeah,
stories we're going
Spectre
to
is
be.
a character that I completely forgot about. Like I know he is such a crucial DC character. I mean,
Yeah,
he's been
I'm trying to
around
think
since the
what
Golden Age.
I'm trying to think really what to say about
I
Spectre
mean,
at this point.
what Spectre really is, Spectre is not necessarily a character that fights the battle.
Right.
What he is there for is perspective. He's basically watching what's taking place, and he's not necessarily like Marvel's Watcher who just stands there and watches. He knows that when he has to intervene, he will intervene,
Yeah.
but he won't necessarily intervene with the purposes of fighting. He will
Right.
intervene with the purposes of perspective and reasoning. Like he will say, okay, but now before you do this, I can see that something that has to get done. The question is, do you really want to? So that's really what he's there for. Spectre is there for the person to provide perspective.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because again, he's another character that has he just shows up closer to the like 2/3 of the way in.
Yeah.
And you're just saying to yourself, okay, it's the Spectre. I know who this character is. He's a pretty cool character, but why did it take so long for him to be here? I'm not saying that it takes away from the story, because believe me, you could if you say that about the Spectre, then you say the same thing about a character like Superboy, or
Yeah.
you say the same thing about like, okay, now why are the villains now suddenly wanting to like? There's These are not reasons why you have to ask questions. It's
Right.
just moving the story.
I agree completely. I agree completely. I mostly mentioned Spectre to say we hadn't mentioned him yet, and I think later on in like the overarching journey that we're going on, he'll matter a lot. So I say his name because it'll come up again. Um, yeah, yeah. I get that. That's really all I had on that topic.
Right. So, as you said at the beginning of this video, the purpose of Crisis on Infinite Earths is to create the brand new age of DC Comics. After
Yeah,
50 years of storytelling, we are now trying to get rid of the clutter, and we're now officially going down the straight and narrow path.
yeah,
And the most important thing is, as we continue on this journey, as we get to Blackest Night, what you're going to see, especially when Geoff Johns officially comes on board to DC and his name starts showing up towards 1998 and 1999, that is when, at least for me, because again, I went backwards. I basically went backwards. Sometimes I even went sideways just to make sure that I got my full perspective. But I definitely noticed an interesting thing that when Geoff Johns started writing his pieces, a very interesting story was starting to take shape.
I will have more on that one later on, to
All
put it
right.
mildly.
Okay, so I think that that's actually going to wrap up our discussion for the first episode of Ultimate Journey DC Edition. I really hope that you all took away something from this, and I'm hoping that you do take the opportunity to read this story if you never have. And honestly, this is also one of those stories that if you never pick up another DC comic book in your entire life, could very much be one of the only reads you'll ever truly need. I mean,
Yeah,
me as a comic book fan, I like to read other stories, but this is definitely one of those perfect stories. You don't necessarily need to backtrack, and you don't necessarily need to go forward. That's what I like about
yeah.
these kinds of stories. But the next time that we get together for Ultimate Journey, we're going to start on the road to Secret Wars over in Marvel. It was a lot more of a challenge to figure out what our starting point is on the road to Secret Wars. But I think
It's not as
we
clean, but I think we got it right. So
absolutely, because unfortunately, where we're going to start is there stuff that you could read before that? Oh, God, if there's anything that I would say, if anything, even though there's not that much connection, just go and pick up everything that Chris Claremont ever did in the
ever
world.
wrote.
Just read that. In the world of Marvel, if that's the only thing that you ever read, Chris Claremont's X-Men run, you're fine.
Just do it. Yeah.
But yeah, but I'm looking forward to our next discussion, Andy. And who knows who will show up? If it's just the two of us, that's great. But if more decide to join us on this journey, that's great too.
Very welcome.
So in the meantime, everybody, we'll see you in the next one.
Sounds good. Bye, everybody. Thanks, Steve.